And so let me start by welcoming our audience to the final security seminar of the semester. We'll be taking a break after this and resuming in mid-January. So you can check out the webpage for who the next speakers are going to be. Of course, all of these talks are archived through our website and on YouTube. Our speakers will entertain questions in the Q&A section. So please don't enter them in a chat. If you have an issue with being able to hear or see some of the talk, you can type in the chat. We'll be monitoring that. But questions for the speakers should be in the Q&A. And speaking of speakers, absolutely delighted that for the end of the semester, we have not one but two experts here to tell you about a really fascinating report that they have done. The title here, Integrating Cyber Capacity into the Digital Development Agenda, is something that has global impact and importance for developing economies and developed economies globally. Our two speakers, Melissa Hathaway, somebody I've had the pleasure of knowing for about 20 years now, who's been doing innovative work in security and information systems in longer than that. And Francesca Spidalieri, who helped her with this report, and the two of them will present to you this afternoon. So please take it away, and our thanks for being here.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Spafford. Jean, it's good to see you, and we're really excited to be able to present this report here at Purdue. Francesca and I had the opportunity and were asked to work on this report by the World Bank and the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise. And those two institutions came together back in June of 2021, identifying the need to bridge these two communities, the cybersecurity community, thinking about more digital resilience as we're spending so much money under digital development. And how can we start to incorporate the benefits of de-risking or cybersecurity into the projects and the initiatives in order to achieve more resilient outcomes? We had the opportunity to launch this report last week on the 30th of November. And we're going to highlight some of the key aspects, the findings, the recommendations, where we think things are going to head over the next, hopefully, year or more or longer. And it would be remiss if we didn't thank the World Bank and the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise, that foundation, for asking us to do this, because we think it's going to have global impact and help build stronger communities in each of the recipient countries, and hopefully bridge the two communities, cybersecurity community with the digital development community and the multilateral development banks. So the project objective was, could we really look at pathways to better align digital development with cybersecurity into the broader digital development agenda? What are their best practices or effective methods to bridge those gaps? Can we start to talk about digital development, digital resiliency, cybersecurity, capacity building writ large? What is stopping these two communities from working together? Are there successful programs or public goods? Digital public goods is what we identify in the report. And we identify a number of digital public goods that could be repurposed and used by the broader community. We also identified some projects where cybersecurity and digital resilience were already embedded. So sort of the narrative of, oh, you could look at this one as something that would be a great example for looking at for when you do it in your country, or when their multilateral development bank or a funding institution comes along. And then finally, we looked at, again, how do you achieve more resilient outcomes, the mechanisms to embed cybersecurity, incorporating cybersecurity into digital development. So when you start to look at, the United Nations estimated that there's a funding gap for building out these digital infrastructures is more than $1 trillion a year. And today we're spending about $170 billion on digital development. And what was really interesting through the course of our interviews and discussions with so many international institutions around the world is that really better cooperation and coordination is needed among these donor communities. We need to create trusted digital connectivity and really get more power for our dollars and our financing of these projects in these developing countries. And we really must address the fact that digital development and cybersecurity are two sides of this of a coin, and they must be incorporated and work together. When you look at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and there are 17 of them, that digitization can accelerate all of those sustainable development goals. And the tools and the ICT are important tools for enabling that. We, in the report, we identify that digital is part of all 17 of the Sustainable Development Goals. And when you start to think about that, the digital technologies, they can optimize the use for an inclusive digital economy, for an inclusive society, to enable skills development, participation in the digital economy, that we're funding development of human and institutional capacity. And that's really important, that we actually develop indigenous capacity in these countries, not just export the knowledge from the Northern Hemisphere or the Western Hemisphere, from the developed world into the developing world, that we have to build to indigenous capacity, that we need to think about online rights as we do offline rights, and that human rights and human agency and how the technologies are enabling participation in society, but also how the technologies could hinder your participation in society. The SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, talk about digital trust, security, stability. And it's very clear that these ICTs, misuse of ICTs, can cause mistrust, can cause insecurity and instability in countries and in provinces or in towns, and we have to address those things. And then finally, fostering digital cooperation. We need more digital cooperation as we're funding more and more digital development. And we need to create these mentor-protege systems and this broader incorporation of, again, the cybersecurity community along with the digital development community. And it's important to note that Secretary Gutierrez, for the last 4 or 5 years, UN Secretary General, has been talking about the dark side of innovation, the cybersecurity threats, and the misuse of ICTs, that they can become tools of cybercrime, of surveillance, of enabling disinformation, enabling espionage, and exploitation of data, and even worse, enabling digital authoritarianism, where it's actually limiting our human rights online, as we experience, as we hope to have, and so we offline. And we need to, really look at this technology and safeguarding it, and then understanding the unintended consequences of the misuse. And again, this is one of the findings that came out across the board through the interviews, is there's so many people who think about the technology of what it's bringing from a good perspective, the digital economy, digital literacy, participation, of being connected to the internet. And there are not many people who are really witting of all of the misuse of, and the downside, or the negatives, the negative externalities of the misuse of the information communication technologies. So the report identifies the pathways to bridge these two communities, to bring really the power of both, and how do we extraordinarily bring capacity to these countries. And right now, it can't be capacity of just we export it. It has to be that we build capacity, indigenous capacity on the ground, so it's sustainable on the ground in these recipient countries. So the power of both. We, in the report, Francesca and I did a really good history lesson, I think, of how did the development community grow up, and then how did the cybersecurity community grow up. And in the international development community, it spans both national, so United States, United Kingdom, Australia, Italy, France, Germany, the national countries that are giving bilateral aid, and the international development agencies or multilateral development banks like the European Bank of Reconstruction, or the World Bank, or the Asia Infrastructure Bank. And then also to the large philanthropic foundations like the Gates Foundation or the Ford Foundation, these private foundations. They didn't start using the term building capacity until the 1990s. And they really did not see that their projects were digital until really the last 5 years or so. And so it was an evolution, and we're hoping to spark and accelerate the digital development community understanding why they need to de-risk their investments. On the other hand, the cybersecurity community, as you all know, through the classes that you're having with Dr. Spafford and at Purdue, is that the cybersecurity community grew up from really very different disciplines, whether it was law enforcement of looking at forensic analysis, or it's the technical community, the computer emergency response teams, the areas that you're studying in computer science, or foreign policy of thinking about rules of engagement, responsible state behavior, or human rights. And cyber capacity building emerged in this policy discussion really just recently in the last decade. And some countries are starting to include a more holistic view in their national strategies. But as a community, the cybersecurity community still really embraces it from their individual disciplines, not as a holistic perspective. And this was one of the areas that we identified in the report, as that we need to come as a cybersecurity community, come together more broadly and open up our aperture on how we're talking about digital risks and digital resilience. We identified the benefits of bridging, and so why do we need to think about bringing these two communities together? Well, first of all, the decision makers, whether it's the decision makers at the banks and the loan institutions, they need to understand that when they're fielding and funding digital, that it needs to be de-risked and that there's problems with the misuse of ICTs. But we also need decision makers in the recipient countries to understand that when they get a loan to build a hospital, or to build an energy grid, or to implement a national identity system, that they too have to think about when and how could these technologies be misused. And understanding that is important for, again, getting sustainable and more resilient outcomes. And then secondarily, we looked at how do you integrate cybersecurity into these development programs from the beginning of the project through the end and the full life cycle of the project. And so that we can start to think about better processes, eliminating duplication of effort, that you don't want to be fixing something after the fact. You want to have thought through it at the very beginning. That how do you maximize the resources and build, again, stronger resilience, safety, security, trust into the technologies that are going to be deployed to enable these key critical services, infrastructures, processes, and procedures in these countries. So these infrastructure investments really need to consider digital, that every part of the 17 sustainable development goals and every infrastructure build out has a digital component. And so the leaders who can think about are more informed and engaged and can ask the right questions. Then they can start to think about risk management. So how will my national identity system, how could it be misused? How should I be protecting the data? How should I be transmitting the data? How should I store the data? And things along those lines. From my energy grid, how should I be thinking about its resilience in the face of an attack or a malicious software or something along those lines, like we've seen in the past against other entities, whether it be Ukraine or even here in the United States. And so we need to think about risk management from the design, again, the very beginning of the project discussion through its implementation, and ensuring that we're going to embed the right funding from each of those levels, whether it be in the loan and financing or into the national budget of the recipient country for the continuity of effort. So one of the key findings that we had is that honestly, we have to update the playbook. We, the developed countries, who are telling these countries what we think they need to do, whether that is develop a cybersecurity strategy, implement a computer emergency response team or service, update their laws, create an information sharing regime, and the like, that we really need to start to think about how do we up-level the conversation about cybersecurity and digital resilience into the country's real economic aspirations. What makes the country strong? What is building their GDP? What are their exports? What are their imports? What are their key national industries? And that all has to be up-leveled into their digital strategy, into their economic strategy, and then the development priorities of the recipient countries. The playbook of 20 years ago of develop a cybersecurity strategy, update your laws are insufficient for going forward over the next 10 to 20 years. We need to really think about how we're going to accelerate the digitization and do it safely with trusted technology. And that requires us to really think about de-risking our investments from the very beginning, both at the recipient country and from the loan financing operations that are coming from these multilateral or private foundations. So we need to think about the funding for continuity and sustainment of the project into the national budget. And unfortunately, we're not really thinking about those things. So I have a 5-year loan or financing operation to build out something that's digital, and I'm not considering the things that need to be replaced at 5 or 7 years, hardware, software, or the training that needs to happen of my personnel or replacement of personnel. And so these things have to be embedded again from start to finish to get to the total cost of ownership and sustainability of these digital projects. Second, we need to be thinking about what does the country need? Not what do we think they should have, but what do they absolutely need? They need water. They need power. They need a school system or an update to their education system. They need these different capacities. So as we're looking at these development initiatives, we have to think about the need of the country, not what we think they should have, and tailor it to the individual national cultural circumstances. What is available there? What is then has to be also part of the funding operations. I'm going to hand it over to Francesca now, and she's going to talk about some of the other findings in the report. Francesca?
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you, Professor Spafford, for having me. So some of the other really interesting findings as we interviewed over 40 multilateral development banks, international, national development agencies, and other international organizations, it's certainly that there is a heightened awareness of the importance of cybersecurity and digital capacity building. And certainly cybersecurity is becoming a growing priority for all of those countries that are seeking assistance, both for their economic development as well as their security needs. But one of the most striking findings was that even if there is this growing understanding and we talk about cyber capacity building, digital capacity building, there is actually no common definition of what these terms entail. So what should be included or who should be responsible for capacity building efforts. In fact, of all the organizations we interviewed, some define it as building institution, computer emergency response team, or other competent authority at the national level. Others as reforming the legal system to better address cybercrime. Others as developing very specific technical operational capacity. Some others just talk about strictly training programs. But very few of those organizations or donor countries actually see capacity building as the whole picture, which involves institutional, governance, legal, technical, and operational capacity development. Again, a lot of those organizations we interviewed use this term as overarching term, but then lay out different and sometimes overlapping cyber capacity building themes, topics, pillars, dimension, or other activities that they include in these buckets of capacity. And because we don't have a common definition of what capacity building is or how it should be developed, often we end up talking past each other. Next slide. Another finding is that cybersecurity, again, digital resilience, are not yet seen as a strategic cross-cutting issue and necessary components of digital development. In fact, as we've heard, digital development community has definitely embraced digital technology and ICTs as a way to accelerate the achievement of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, promote inclusion, and other of their overarching goals and objectives, but they still consider cybersecurity as outside of the development community and development goals. And one of the problems is that there is a problem with the way we frame the narrative around cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is still generally perceived as a national security issue, as a national defense or military problem, as a law enforcement issue or intelligence problem. And this perception often also means that cybersecurity is seen as best delivered by professionals only in those specific communities. So what we argue in the report is that in order to mainstream cybersecurity and digital resilience into the development thinking, we should reframe the cybersecurity narrative in terms of digital resilience, safety, trust, sustainability, risk management, rather than just security. Another problem or issue related to this perception issue is the fact that cybersecurity is not part of the official development assistance criteria established by the OECD. For those of you who are not familiar, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development that was established in the early 60s developed this concept of official development assistance to identify specifically the kind of funding that government agencies would provide to developing countries and to multilateral development institutions to promote economic growth and sustainability. And these sets of rules and criteria for eligible funding is still today the gold standard of foreign government assistance and is still the main source of financing for development aid today. But these criteria specifically exclude, for example, military aid, the promotion of donor security interest, and cybersecurity is often perceived as part of those issues and therefore becomes often a constraint for those donor countries that want to fund cybersecurity projects, but they're not allowed to. And they have to either find different pathways to fund those cybersecurity efforts. So they call them spatial items of development as part of digital transformation or reform to the legal system, or they have to fund them as completely outside the scope of these development assistance criteria. So what we are arguing in the report is that the Development Assistance Committee of the OECD should update this criteria, just like they update the list of countries that are eligible for this type of development funding. And they should include digital resilience to those criteria for eligible assistance and as part of their specific peace and security activities. And this would help enable those cybersecurity related assistance and programs. Next slide. So again, another of the finding as we talk to all these different organizations is that even when we're able to fund cybersecurity initiatives and cyber capacity building or digital development projects that have a cybersecurity component, unfortunately, most donors, implementers, and even the recipient countries, as Melissa said before, still see technology, digital technology, information and communication technologies as a long-term capital asset, as a one-time only expense instead of commodities. And we all know that hardware and software will need to be updated and replaced at least every 5 to 10 years. And if it's not, this will make those development programs or even cybersecurity capacity building activities unsustainable because the technology will no longer be used safely. And many developing countries can't even afford the long-term cost to sustain the technology, the institution, the workforce that they originally developed with the funds that they received from developed countries and multilateral development banks. So that's something that we all need to address by including the total cost of ownership from ICT support to system upgrades and repairs and maintenance into the project formulation. It has to be programmed into those assistance package, and the recipient country itself must embed the ICT commodity refresh, ICT support, upgrades, workforce training, retention into its own national budget so that it can be sustainable. Now, the rest of the reports, as Melissa also briefly mentioned, highlights the benefits of incorporating cybersecurity, digital resilience, and cyber capacity building into the broader development agenda. And we also highlighted some noteworthy efforts to develop these so-called digital public goods. These are universal tools and instruments that can be shared, repurposed, and applied globally. Even the United Nations Roadmap for Digital Cooperation that was published in 2020, pushed for the creation of these digital public goods as a way to help support and also accelerate the sustainable development goals. And Secretary Guterres, even in September, through a new report called Our Common Agenda, again, encouraged the fact that we need to improve digital cooperation and create these digital public goods. In the reports, we highlight several of these tools, programs, projects that are available and they should be used more broadly. I'll mention a couple, but I encourage you again to read more in our report and to go check out these organizations. CREST, for example, this institution in the UK has developed a cybersecurity maturity model that is freely accessible and affordable and can help measure the maturity and the financial inclusion of the cyber ecosystem of a country. So when you have this type of assessment, then you can compare country sector organization, you can identify good practices, you can highlight gaps and better address them. Another important tool, and that's where you'll find our report, is the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise Civil Portal, which already captures many of these digital public goods, but is also today the largest database of existing cyber capacity building projects, methodology, frameworks, tools, other resources, papers such as ours. The GFCE is also serving as a clearinghouse. So it has this role and helps better direct various requests for support for cyber capacity building and connect the requesting countries with possible donors and implementers. Another one that I absolutely recommend to go check out is the USAID Cybersecurity Primer, which really shows why and how to incorporate cybersecurity and digital resilience safeguards throughout an entire program lifecycle, whether it's a development project or cybersecurity specific activities. What all of these efforts have in common anyway is that they can serve multiple communities and they can be shared and applied globally. They can help start bridging that development and cyber capacity building thinking, and mostly they can help better fund the specific needs of a country and let those funding be more focused and based on a demand-driven approach rather than a supply-driven approach. Other key recommendations throughout the report that really emphasize the need to cultivate the local cybersecurity workforce, to develop indigenous capacity, as Melissa was saying earlier. But doing that requires addressing some of the challenges first, such as affordability of cyber certification. Again, here I go back to some of the digital public goods we identified. CREST, for example, has been doing a lot to provide affordable professional level certification, accreditation, career pathways for individuals. We also need to develop better curricula. They're tailored to the specific country, and they are developed with the school and university in mind, which is, for example, something that Japan International Cooperation Agency has been doing in partnership with local universities. Another challenges we need to address is that, again, we need to identify and grow local talent and develop programs that are suited for that specific community, country, that identify the risk and the challenges of that country without necessarily exporting our way of thinking or our tools, our knowledge, and our people. Closely related to that is the need to generate local buy-in of the local leaders. But in order to design more tailored programs, develop indigenous capacity, and generate that local buy-in, first we need to better understand the local ecosystem, the context, the digital risk to society. And we can't do that if we don't have local data trends, statistics, field research. One of the things we found is that even in developing countries, they're often still using Western sources and Western results to address cyber threats. And instead, we need to have better local data, local statistics. We need to engage all the different local stakeholders, including government, civil society, and academia, so they can gather data, they can analyze, and this will help us better develop those digital development projects that are tailored to those specific needs of that recipient country, and can also help making a more compelling argument as to why cybersecurity is important to that country and that community. And this hopefully will help generate that local buy-in by framing those activities in terms of economic development, digital resilience, safety, trust, sustainability, risk management, where we said that we need to reframe the narrative of cybersecurity. And so in order to do all of this, we need to allocate funding to the local universities, students, researchers, so that they can gather the local evidence, they can conduct trend analysis in that country or region, and they can help better characterize the threat within the, again, society, community, country, or region. And we need to include the local private sector, which is a crucial partner in developing, again, a cybersecurity ecosystem, in building capacity, and it has a vetted interest really in the economic and societal growth of that country. And last but not least, go to the next slide, we need to help raise awareness and increase practical collaboration between the organizations that are already present in the community. And to do that, we should use local development organization and civil society, who might have not prioritized cybersecurity until now, but they have a better understanding of the local challenges, the connection within the local community, and they have valuable relationship, but also with the local implementer. So those organizations can actually help raise the local cybersecurity awareness. They can help build cybersecurity capacity. And this can be also a great opportunity for the cybersecurity community and the development community to work together. Again, the development community brings their on-the-ground experience, networks, relationship, while the cybersecurity capacity building community can bring that extensive expertise, hopefully together with local experts and local buy-in, and develop successful programs. So Melissa, I'll pass it out to you, but I look forward to questions.
So the next part is that when you look at what's going on of the $170 billion in digital development projects, there is what is noted in the development community. There are darling countries, and then there are countries that are not necessarily have been prioritized for digital development or for development writ large. The darling countries are those where many banks or international institutions are trying to bring digital development. And so we identified that we really have to avoid the duplication of effort. There needs to be much better, stronger coordination among the development institutions of how can they do a better handoff of, I'm going to start this project and then you can do the next project. And so that we're getting more holistic development and sustainable development in the recipient countries, and then focus on broader approaches and solutions. And then if we deduplicate our efforts, then in theory, we should have more money available for those countries that are not receiving the development funding, or the orphans. We did identify some really interesting best practices, for example, in Kenya, where Kenya had received development funding and had developed some capacity, and then had developed enough capacity to start to be a regional expert and pass on its capacity and development into the broader region. And we look at that as maybe a best practice or something that could be replicated in other parts of the world. Of the development loan and financing helped one country, and then that country was able to help others. Again, that starts to get to optimizing our resources for more resilient outcomes. Finally, in the report, we identified the importance of networking the networks. During the course of this, all of the different interviews and the meetings that Francesca and I had, we ended up actually already becoming the bridge of connecting development communities to development communities, developing and connecting some of the digital public goods that nobody was aware of to these communities, and just starting the conversation and making those connections, almost like the 1 degree network of I'm going to connect this person, and then they become the next connection, and then the next connection. So we identified in the toward the end of the report, the venues for bringing this international development community together with the cybersecurity community that doesn't normally happen, and how you can start to help spark that conversation and build those relationships on the margins of meetings, or through the coffee houses, or on the ground in the recipient countries. So some bridging venues that we identified that we've already participated in: the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise had a meeting with the Organization of American States, and earlier in November, we had the launch of our report last week. We're here today with you at Purdue, and hopefully speaking to many people all around the world, that you can be part of this community and start to communicate the importance of bridging these communities. There's the Democracy Summit this week in the United States. There is the UN is having a conference with the least developed countries in Doha in January. Indonesia assumes the presidency of the G20. That's made digital development a high priority, which will be followed by India's presidency of the G20 in 2023. And we invite everybody to help us understand where are other bridging venues that could happen in any geography that it is, because we think this is so important, that if we bring these communities together, we can in fact see sustainable development, resilient development that's digitally based. So we invite your questions through this, and we're very excited to be here with you today. You can follow the GFCE at that Twitter protocol, the World Bank's digital development at that Twitter account, and Francesca and I are at Cyber Readiness Ready Index at that Twitter account. Again, the URL is at the bottom of the slide. We invite you to read it. We look forward to your questions, and thank you so much to Dr. Spafford and Purdue for inviting us here this afternoon to speak with you on what we think is a really transformational report. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. And for the audience, if you have some questions or perhaps comments, please enter them in the Q&A section here. I noted in the chat that we put a link to the report itself on the page with the abstract and bios. And that will be available for anyone who wants to click through to look at it. So I'll ask here in the interim while we're waiting to see if somebody has a question. Suppose some of our students, for instance, wanted to find a way to get directly involved in this. We have a policy institute here. We involve some of our political science faculty and liberal arts students in the cybersecurity program. So do you have some really specific suggestions as to things that they can do if they're interested in following up on this?
Well, I'll start and then I'll hand it over to Francesca. I think that one of the most important things, especially as for students who are working on a thesis or even undergrad students, is when you go, if you were to do a study abroad or you were working in one of these countries, it's really understanding what is going on there and collecting that local data, helping and working with the students or in that community of what's the level of crime and fraud? What is the primary use of ICT in the country? Most of the developing countries, the people don't have computers, they have cell phones. How are they using that technology? Is it for everything? Is it social media? Is it for banking and finance? Is it for paying for your groceries, which is also true in most of the developing world? And then what, if anything, is happening from a misuse of the ICT? I'm tracking, there's a high degree of either child exploitation or bullying online, which is at a different level than what we see here in the United States. So being able to communicate that of here's some of the challenges of misuse of ICT, even understanding just the date or the version of what's the technology they're using. Are they using Windows 97, or not updatable software is also really interesting, because then they're 100% vulnerable 100% of the time.
Right.
And those, I think, those are some really important things that I think, from just a practical on the ground of situation awareness and being able to communicate that back or document it in an academic way that can be used for decision makers. Francesca?
Yeah, and to follow up on that, regardless of what the students are studying, I would encourage them to understand the interconnection and interdependencies, because one of the main issues as we wrote this report is that we wanted to use the proper terminology that spoke in this case to the development community. But students should understand the cyber risk of increased digitization, and whether they're focusing on policy, governance, institution, computer science, they need to learn how to make those connections, so that one day, when they are the ones talking to the policymakers, to the national leaders, to the head of a bank or a school or a hospital, they know how to make these arguments in the terminology that speaks to that national leaders. And so that takes time to refine that narrative, to refine that language. So one of our recommendations in the report was to reframe the narrative of cybersecurity in terms of trust, resiliency, digital, because we're talking to the development community, and we need to speak their language in order for them to embed cybersecurity and digital resilience in their program. But no matter what your students are studying, they will have to bring that cybersecurity, that digital resilience into their organization, into their field of study. So learn how to reframe that narrative so that it speaks to the leaders that you will be informing and educating.
And, just to build on that, is that you could even look at it here in the United States, that we just passed a $1 trillion Build Back Better infrastructure bill. And it does not talk about digital resilience and security. There's a whole separate line item of 1.7 billion for cybersecurity to go to CISA or to different agencies, but it's not talking about integral, that infrastructure development and fielding, and the Build Back Better has to be secure, resilient, safe, and trusted. And so we have the same problem here in the developed world, that we need to blend these two communities. And that requires people in your programs to be able to translate those things, because we can't keep on making these same mistakes.
Right. And in fact, we didn't even get in basic elements of incident reporting in the NDAA because of quibbles. So I think this is really an important point, and one that we've tried to stress here in some of our classes, is that our students generally are going to go into positions where they have to talk to people who don't have cyber as a background, and it isn't even necessarily understood as a priority. They need to speak in terms of risk and cost benefit and safety and economic potential. And so learning how to talk about those issues is really critically important. I have something else I'll ask, but I will defer here to the fact that we have somebody in the Q&A who has a question. So I'll let you answer that first, and then if there's time, I'll pose my second question. So do you have it there, or would you like me to read it?
I can see it. It basically says, in deciding which countries nations support or ally with regarding economic digital development, many are the opinion that security is one of the primary determinant or value of such nations, and then looking at the security, building trust and trusted efforts. So if you go back to all of our countries and the OECD countries, from a bilateral perspective, are from a digital development perspective, are bound by the OECD requirements or criteria. And so each of our regions or each of our countries have different priorities based on our own economic interests, but the development as right now precludes or excludes cybersecurity. It's digital development and nation building or infrastructure building and along those lines. So I'll just give you some perspectives from a Europe perspective. Many of the European, one part of the European investment infrastructures are all about Eastern Europe and making sure that those countries are in the Eastern neighborhood, which would include Ukraine and Georgia and some of the like Serbia, Montenegro, et cetera, that they actually get infrastructure build out. That's important to Europe for Europe's security interests, but also for Europe's economic interests. Whereas other countries bilaterally, like Australia, is looking at in the Asia Pacific realm. And for the United States, we're focused on various countries for development. Canada is focused on Organization of American States in South America. So each of our countries are focused on different areas. We don't always coordinate, which is why we have darlings and orphans. But the development criteria is really based on development. It's not based on security, but it absolutely has an economic intersection to it. And in fact, I would say that the majority of our countries are thinking about this as an export strategy of export our talent, our knowledge, our people, right, our industries. And we have, as a developed world, have not focused enough on developing indigenous capacity in any of these countries. From a security perspective, it was not something that came out as a focal point just because of from the development community and the OECD criteria that is actually excluded or precluded. I'm not saying that's not done, but because I do observe that around the world from different countries. It's just not a focus of this report based on the OECD criteria. Fran, do you have anything to add?
No, that's absolutely correct. And by the way, keep in mind that only 38 countries are part of the OECD. So the OECD, despite establishing the criteria for development aid, it's made up of the 38 most, economically and technologically developed countries in the world. So I'm not trying to say anything against the OECD having this role, but it's another reason why they should review and update those criteria and include and incorporate other real needs of those countries that are on the receiving end and not part of the OECD.
Well, that really sort of in part touches a little on what I was going to ask, and that is that we speak of in many places a sort of digital divide between the haves, the haves not, within populations and within countries. And so part of the question there, pointing to Africa, but not limited to Africa, certainly other parts of the world, we have exploited their resources of those countries by leveraging the fact that very often they need the cash infusion. They don't have the technical prowess locally to take advantage of it. And it seems to me that some of what we would worry about as a security issue is that those countries could still be ripe for that kind of exploitation if they don't have the protections in place. That and we know of examples, for instance, where bids for extraction of minerals have been skewed by being viewed by some of the parties, despite being supposed to be confidential until being opened officially. And certain amounts of corruption, which were alluded to in the question as well, that we know in many countries that the money has resulted in corruption of leadership. If we don't have the transparency and the security of some of the computing that's being used for communication, it may perpetuate that. So are these issues that you touched on in any depth, or are these more secondary characteristics after some of the more pressing initial elements?
One quick point in addition to what you just said is that we did highlight in the report is that many of those developing countries are leapfrogging in their use of technology. And so because they're going so fast in their digitization process without necessarily taking the time to learn how to use those technologies securely, learn about cyber hygiene and awareness, they're actually also becoming now a threat to developed countries, because they now become the place from where a lot of the attacks are originating. And it's because those countries are digitizing super fast. They might be harboring some of the criminals because maybe they don't have the legal regime in place yet, or they have all these vulnerable devices that they've adopted so fast. You know, in most developing countries, they're doing their online banking from their phone, but they don't necessarily secure their phone. So that device can become part of a botnet or be the originator of other attacks. So the developed world should pay even more attention, because it can be actually in a worse place if we don't help those countries learn about cybersecurity and resilience as they continue very fast to digitize and take advantage of digital technology to advance their growth and their societal development.
And I would just add to one last point to everything. I agree with everything that Francesca said. And one other point is that one of the things that we discovered in doing this research is that when we do an infusion of capital into any of these developing countries, and we start to develop that talent may go into industry and do things that are great, but they may also go into criminal syndicates and actually start to conduct the crime and fraud, now knowing what could be done with the skill sets that we have actually transferred to them. And so there are many challenges going forward and that have to be addressed, but aligning the digital development community with the cybersecurity community can only lead to good things versus continuing to perpetuate basically cyber insecurity by not de-risking or not embedding the resilience, safety, trust into these loans and financing operations.
Yeah, that sort of echoes what happens back in the 80s when the Soviet Union fell, and we had all these talented programmers who couldn't make a living in their country. Bulgaria notably was one. And they started writing a lot of computer viruses and various kinds of theftware at the time. As you remember, I know we discussed that in the past. There's another question in the Q&A if you'd care to address.
Sure. I think briefly, we follow the money. The majority of the money for development projects still comes from countries, donor countries, national and international development organization. And because the task was to understand how to bridge these two communities, the majority of the organization we interviewed were multilateral development banks and were donor countries. But we do talk about civil society, local organization as part of our recommendation, how to better connect with the local community. And also we interviewed pretty much every UN agency and body that deals with either cybersecurity or development. And obviously those agency and bodies do work also with local NGOs and other independent civil society organizations. So they were certainly part of the report. They are part of our recommendations. But again, we follow the money.
We followed the money. And if for anybody who wants to learn about any of these institutions, we have an annex that highlights all of what their capabilities are, what they're focused on, some of the digital public goods that they have prepared. And so it's a good primer for anybody in international relations or international development. If you want to understand internationally what's going on in this space, read the annex.
Great, thank you. We have time if people have one or another question, and we're getting some good answers here, as well as there's a lot of material in the report that is well worth reading. Tremendous amount of effort went into it, and I hope it's heeded by some of the people, the decision makers, rather than just another great, we've addressed it and that's it, which is the way a lot of cybersecurity is handled, as you know, is we've got a report, it's taken care of.
Yeah, I think we've gotten some very positive feedback from some of the institutions that Inter-American Development Bank said this is really important because they're working on their digital strategy and how they build resilience into their loans and financing operations. The same for the Asia Infrastructure Bank that's funding a lot of the Belt and Road Initiative areas, that this was something that was transformational to them because they had not thought about the cybersecurity or the misuse of ICT. So it was going to fundamentally change the way they were thinking about project development from inception to execution. And then I think that just the fact that we've got some of the development community speaking to the development community and got the USAID's primer into the development community and circulated it among everybody, or introduced everybody to CREST as a platform to either do a risk assessment or a platform to understand what were some of the companies in each region that could actually be execution arms for the loans and bring that expertise. So I think we've already made a difference. I think I'm looking forward to events like this that could get more awareness of what the report entails and just spark the conversation. I think the most important thing is once you get the conversation going, then you could start to get to action, and then again, more resilient outcomes is the desire.
And Professor Spafford, maybe here's another recommendation for your student as they start doing their own research, or they join a think tank or research institute. If they're able to make those connections before they start a report, and so that they have a champion, whether it's an international organization or a country, then there is a better chance that once the report is published, somebody's taking on those recommendations and trying to actually use them and implement them. So I think I'm confident about the result of our report, because the organization who commissioned it really wanted it, and they seem so far committed to champion this recommendation and take them forward, whether it's with the OECD or with other organizations. So we need more research in this field, but it can't be just research for the sake of writing another pretty paper. It has to be connected to specific outcomes. And again, if you already have that champion, because your think tank, your research institute is responding to a grant or is being commissioned by the World Bank or UN body or others, then there is a better chance that the recommendations they come up with are taken on by that organization of that country.
Oh, that's great. That is reason to hope. And in fact, as you were both speaking, I was thinking, wouldn't it be wonderful if not only was some of this adopted to help guide many countries in their development, but if as a result that applied some back pressure on the more developed countries to actually improve some of the infrastructure that we have in place, where we have failed to put in some of the safeguards that we know how to do, but we just have been moving forward so quickly. We haven't done it. If some of the more developing countries leapfrog us there, maybe that will be a good example for the rest of us. So yes. Well, I don't see any other questions. This has been delightful. I want to thank both of you for taking the time and joining us today. We will let you know when the recording is up, but hopefully we have a lot of people going to read the report and listen to this recording and go out and make a difference in the world. That's really what we encourage our students to do, and anybody else who tunes in on these talks. So thank you both again. Have a wonderful holiday season. And for our audience, thank you for tuning in again. As I noted in the notes, our next talk will be on January 12th. Visit the seminar webpage to see the details. Any last comments, Melissa, Francesca?
Thank you for having us, and I hope we get the invitation now for all of your amazing talks.
Thank you.
Yep. Any that you would like to tune in on? We try to announce them several weeks in advance on the website, and you're more than welcome to attend any of them or look at any of the recorded ones. So thank you again, and it's great to see you again.
Happy holidays. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.